It was a quiet Tuesday night. The living room was dimly lit by the flicker of the television, but Hector wasn't watching. He sat on the couch, his mind lost in thought as he absent-mindedly swirled the beer in his hand. The muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing from upstairs had become familiar to him over the past few weeks. Every night, Sophia would disappear upstairs, getting ready for something, somewhere, but never for him. Tonight, though, the air felt different. The rustling of fabric from the bedroom was more hurried, almost frantic. Hector sighed, his grip tightening around the neck of the beer bottle. His patience had worn thin. He knew something was wrong. He had known for months. Then, the creak of the stairs pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Sophia stood halfway down the stairs, wearing a bright red bikini. Her skin gleamed under the faint light, her long hair cascading down her shoulders. It wasn't the kind of outfit you'd expect to see your wife wearing in the middle of the night. Certainly not when you're both alone in the house. "What the hell is this?" Hector blurted, sitting upright, the bottle slipping from his hand and landing on the floor with a soft thud. His voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger. Sophia paused, her hand on the railing, and glanced down at him with a smirk that made his stomach churn. "It's for him," she said flatly, her eyes sharp with contempt. "What the hell do you mean, him?" Hector demanded, his pulse quickening as he stood. His voice cracked under the weight of his growing rage. Sophia descended the stairs slowly, deliberately. "My lover," she said, as if the words should have been obvious to him. "It's a bikini-themed party, and he likes me this way." She reached the bottom of the stairs, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor as she made her way across the room. She didn't even look at him as she spoke, like he was a stranger in his own home. "You've got to be kidding me," Hector muttered, shaking his head as disbelief gave way to cold, hard anger. "You think it's okay to—" "You wouldn't understand," Sophia interrupted, finally turning to face him. "You've never been the kind of man who knows how to treat a woman like me." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always known that things between them weren't perfect, but he had never expected this. For years, he had worked hard to build a life with her. He wasn't wealthy, but they had enough, or so he had thought. Hector clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, despite the fury building inside him. "To meet him," Sophia replied with a scoff. "Obviously." She tossed her hair over her shoulder with a dismissive flick. "Why? Do you actually think you can stop me?" The defiance in her voice made his blood boil. He took a step toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I swear to God," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage, "I'll break your legs if you step out of this house." The threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Sophia stopped and turned to face him fully, the smirk gone from her lips. For a moment, there was silence as the tension between them thickened. Then, slowly, a new smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, one filled with cold amusement. "You can't control me, Hector," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're a loser. You can barely afford a McDonald's meal, let alone make me stay." The words hit him like a sledgehammer, each syllable driving deeper into his chest. He had heard her belittle him before, but never like this. Her cruelty was on full display now, without the pretense of civility. "You really think that guy cares about you?" Hector shot back, his voice low but sharp. "You think he's in love with you? Or is it just about what you're giving him right now?" Sophia let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "He buys me designer bags, luxury clothes, things you could never even dream of affording." "Look at you, Hector," she said, her eyes scanning him from head to toe with disgust. "Look at the pathetic life you've built. You're a joke." The venom in her voice was palpable, and it left Hector stunned. He had never felt so small, so completely crushed under the weight of her words. He stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to process everything that was happening. Sophia turned away from him, her heels clicking again as she walked toward the front door. She didn't bother to grab a coat, didn't care that it was late or that her outfit was wildly inappropriate for anywhere but a poolside party. As she reached for the doorknob, Hector found his voice again. "You're making a mistake, Sophia," he said, his tone flat but firm. "That guy, he's going to use you and then leave you. You'll end up with nothing. She stopped, hand on the doorknob, and turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him from the corner of her eye. You know what, Hector? She said, her voice soft, but laced with cruelty. Even if that happens, it'll still be better than staying here with you. Before he could respond, the door swung open, and Sophia stepped out into the night, the sound of her laughter lingering in the air like a taunt. The door slammed shut behind her, the noise echoing through the now empty room. Hector stood there, staring at the door, his mind reeling. He felt a hollowness growing in his chest, a sinking realization that the life he thought he had built was now crumbling to pieces. The silence in the house after Sophia left felt suffocating. Hector sank back onto the couch, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on him like an anchor. His mind whirled, torn between disbelief and cold anger. How had it come to this? The woman he had trusted, loved, and built a life with was openly flaunting an affair as if he were nothing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared blankly at the floor. The house, once a place of warmth and love, now felt like a prison. The sounds of her laughter echoed in his head, taunting him, each memory sharper than the last. How long had this been going on? He replayed the past months in his mind. Her late nights out, the unexplained text messages, the sudden disinterest in him. It all started to make sense, and it made his stomach turn. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. The quiet hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen was the only noise in the room, until ding. The familiar chime of his phone snapped him out of his daze. He reached for it, expecting some routine notification or a late-night email. But the message on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was Sophia's number. The subject line of the message was chilling in its simplicity. "Hey, loser. Thought you'd want to see this." He hesitated for a moment, a pit forming in his stomach, before he tapped on the message to open it. There was no text, just a video file. His thumb hovered over the play button. Part of him didn't want to know, didn't want to confirm the gut-wrenching suspicions that had been gnawing at him for months. But he had to see it. He needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly. The video began to play, and immediately his blood ran cold. There she was, Sophia, laughing, wearing that same red bikini from earlier in the night. She was sitting on top of another man and grinning like crazy, her arms wrapped around his neck as they kissed, oblivious to everything except each other. They caressed each other. The backdrop was a lavish hotel room, complete with expensive decor and an opulence that mocked Hector's modest, hard-earned life. His stomach twisted, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He watched in disbelief as the woman he had loved for years, the woman he had married, betrayed him in the most vulgar, explicit way possible. The man in the video was younger, more muscular, and dressed in designer clothes. They laughed together as if their affair was a celebration, with Sophia tossing her hair and looking more alive than Hector had seen her in months. His heart pounded in his chest, rage and hurt mixing together into something uncontrollable. He felt like an outsider in his own life, watching the wreckage of his marriage unfold through a screen. Hector's hands shook as he held the phone, his vision narrowing as he focused on every humiliating detail. Each laugh, each touch, each moment was a knife twisting in his gut. He couldn't watch anymore. He threw the phone onto the couch, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the gravity of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a casual fling. This was a complete betrayal, right in his face, as if she wanted him to know, as if it didn't even matter to her anymore. He stood up abruptly, unable to stay still any longer. His body moved on instinct, fueled by the anger and pain flooding through him. He stormed into the kitchen, yanking open the drawer where they kept the stationery, pulling out a piece of paper. He didn't need to think. The words spilled out of him, simple but final. "I'm done. You wanted this. Goodbye." He scrawled his name at the bottom, barely able to keep his hand steady as he wrote. The ink smeared slightly, but it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for clarity. This was the end. He placed the note on the counter, right next to the fruit bowl where Sophia always left her keys. His gaze lingered for a moment, the reality of his decision beginning to sink in. This was the house they had built together, the life they had shared, and now it was over, crumbling in front of him like a house of cards. Hector turned, walking toward the bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The room was quiet, empty, but her presence still lingered in the air. He opened the closet and grabbed a suitcase from the top shelf. His hands moved with mechanical precision as he packed, just the essentials. Clothes, toiletries, his laptop. He didn't need much. He just needed to get away, far from this place, far from her. As he zipped up the suitcase, his phone buzzed again from the living room. Another message. He ignored it. There was no need to see more. He had seen enough. With the suitcase in hand, Hector walked back into the living room. The house was eerily quiet, but there was a strange calm settling over him now. The anger had receded, replaced by a cold clarity. This was it. He was leaving, and he wasn't coming back. He grabbed his phone from the couch, avoiding the sight of the video still paused on the screen, and shoved it into his pocket. The divorce papers would come soon enough. He didn't need to wait around for her reaction, for her excuses or her lies. He walked toward the front door, his hand hesitating for just a second on the handle. He glanced back one last time at the home that had once been filled with love and laughter, now just a hollow shell of broken promises. Without another word, Hector opened the door and stepped outside into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the sky dark. He closed the door behind him with a soft click, the sound barely registering in his ears. As he walked down the driveway, suitcase in hand, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The weight of her betrayal was still there, but with every step he took, it felt lighter. He didn't know where he was going, but it didn't matter. Anywhere was better than here. The next day, Hector filed for divorce. There was no confrontation, no emotional showdown. He left the paperwork in the hands of his lawyer and disappeared from Sophia's life without a trace. He needed revenge. He wants to see her suffer. Walking away, leaving her to the mess she had made. That was enough. 3 years had passed since Hector walked out of that house and out of Sophia's life for good. In those years, he had worked tirelessly to rebuild himself, not just financially but emotionally too. The journey had been hard at first, filled with sleepless nights and moments where the pain of betrayal crept back into his mind, but slowly he had healed. Hector moved to a new city, somewhere far enough that memories of Sophia couldn't follow him. He rented a small apartment at first, modest but comfortable, a place where he could start fresh. He threw himself into work, determined to make something of himself, something better than the man Sophia had dismissed as a loser. His investment firm had started small, a risk that few would have taken, but Hector had poured his heart and soul into it. Late nights, countless hours of research, and the willingness to take calculated risks began to pay off. Slowly but surely, the business grew, and with it, Hector's confidence. He was no longer the man who couldn't afford designer bags or luxury vacations. He was building a future, and this time it was on his terms. By the end of the 3rd year, Hector had moved into a sleek, modern condo overlooking the city, a far cry from the suburban home he once shared with Sophia. His firm had expanded, and his clients trusted him with millions. He had finally achieved the financial success that Sophia had once mocked him for never having. But it wasn't just about the money. The real victory for Hector was in how he had rediscovered himself. He had built a circle of genuine friends, people who cared for him, who had been there for him through the hardest times. He found joy in the small things, morning runs along the waterfront, quiet dinners with friends, and occasionally just sitting alone in his apartment with a good book and a glass of wine. It was a peaceful, simple life, but it was his, and it was enough. Then, one day, as he was sitting at his kitchen table, enjoying his coffee and going through the mail, he noticed an envelope that made his heart skip a beat. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sophia's. How she knows my address. For a moment, Hector just stared at the envelope, his mind racing with questions. Why now? What could she possibly want after all this time? His first instinct was to toss it into the trash without even opening it. After all, he had moved on, right? But curiosity got the better of him. The letter shook in Hector's hands as he unfolded it, his fingers trembling slightly. Despite everything he had been through, he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to hear from Sophia again, let alone receive a letter begging for his attention. He scanned the first few lines, his eyes narrowing as he took in her desperate tone. "Dear Hector, I don't know how to begin this letter. I thought I had everything. The life I wanted, the luxury, the excitement, but it all fell apart. I made a mistake, Hector. A huge mistake." Hector let out a slow breath, already anticipating where this was going. He had seen it happen before, to friends, colleagues, people who had chased after temporary highs, only to crash back down to reality when it was too late. But he never thought Sophia would be one of them. The woman who once held herself above everyone else, who left him in the dust for a life she deemed better. "The man I left you for," she continued, "he dumped me. He moved on to someone younger, prettier. I thought I was special to him, that I meant something, but I was just another woman in a long line of others. And now, I have nothing." He paused, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him was tempted to feel pity, but another part, the stronger part, couldn't help but feel the bitter satisfaction of karma finally catching up to her. She had made her choice. She had left him for someone who offered her nothing more than material wealth and fleeting attention. And now, that world had come crashing down around her. "I'm living in a tiny, rundown apartment," she wrote. "I can barely afford my rent. I've sold most of the things I thought would make me happy just to get by. And the people I thought were my friends? They're all gone. I'm alone. Hector. Completely alone." He chuckled bitterly at the irony. The woman who once prided herself on being surrounded by wealth and luxury was now reduced to nothing, abandoned by the same people who had filled her head with the idea that money and status were everything. He could picture her now, sitting in some dingy apartment, clutching onto the remnants of a life she had thrown away. The image brought no joy to Hector, just a grim sense of closure. He set the letter down on the table, rubbing a hand over his face. For years, he had wondered if Sophia ever regretted her decision, if she ever thought about the life they could have had. And now, here it was, her confession, her plea for forgiveness. But it was too late. His mind flashed back to that night 3 years ago. The image of her in that red bikini, sneering at him, laughing in his face as she walked out of their home to meet another man. The way she had called him a loser, throwing her affair in his face like it was some twisted badge of honor. That memory had haunted him for so long, but now it felt distant, like a story he had read long ago, not something he had lived through. The letter continued, each line dripping with desperation. "I miss you, Hector. I miss us. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But can we talk? Please. I don't know what to do anymore. I was wrong, and I see that now. I'm sorry. I really am." Hector leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Sorry. The word felt hollow now, too late to make any difference. She wasn't sorry when she was living it up with her lover, flaunting her new life in his face. She wasn't sorry when she abandoned him, leaving him to pick up the pieces of a life they had built together. Now, when she had nothing left, now she was sorry. He picked up the letter again, rereading the last few lines. "I need your help, Hector. I don't have anyone else to turn to." For a moment, he wondered what she thought would happen. Did she imagine that he would swoop in, save her from the mess she had created? That he would just forget everything she had done, forgive her, and let her back into his life as if nothing had happened? He stood up, pacing around the room, his thoughts racing. 3 years ago, her betrayal had nearly destroyed him. He had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering what he had done wrong, why he wasn't enough. But now, as he stood here, the man he had become, he realized something. He didn't need her anymore. Hector had moved on. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, finding success on his own terms. He had learned to be happy without her, to thrive without the weight of her betrayal hanging over him. And now, standing in his kitchen, holding this letter, he realized that he had finally won. Not in the way she had once thought, through wealth or status, but by finding peace within himself, by learning to value the things that truly mattered. He had surrounded himself with real friends, people who supported him, who didn't care about his bank account or the clothes he wore. He had built a life of substance, not flash, and that was something Sophia would never understand. With a calm resolve, Hector folded the letter neatly and set it back on the counter. He wasn't going to respond. There was nothing left to say. He had given her everything once, and she had thrown it away. Now, it was her turn to live with the consequences of her choices. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the skyline. The world was moving forward, and so was he. The pain of the past was behind him, and the future stretched out before him, full of possibilities. Karma had done its work, and now, as Hector stood there, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. Several days after Sophia's letter arrived, Hector found himself standing outside a small coffee shop in the heart of the city. He had debated whether to meet her at all, but a part of him wanted to see her one last time. Not to reconcile, but to close the chapter definitively. He had nothing to prove to her anymore, but something inside him sought closure, a chance to finally say goodbye. He glanced at his watch. She was late, as usual. It was a habit of hers he remembered all too well, always making him wait, as if her time was somehow more valuable than his. But this time, Hector wasn't anxious or impatient. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching the people pass by on the busy street outside, the bustle of the city a distant hum in his mind. He was at peace, and nothing Sophia could say or do would change that. When the door to the cafe finally swung open and Sophia walked in, Hector almost didn't recognize her. The woman standing before him was a shadow of the person he once knew. Gone were the designer clothes, the expensive handbags, and the air of superiority that had once surrounded her. Instead, she wore a simple, worn-out jacket, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired, fragile, and beaten down by life. For a moment, Hector felt a pang of sympathy. But then he remembered. This was the same woman who had walked out on him, who had laughed in his face, belittled him, and left him to pick up the pieces of their shattered marriage. He couldn't afford to feel sorry for her now. "Hector," she said softly, her voice trembling as she approached the table. She looked down, avoiding eye contact, her hands nervously clutching the strap of her worn purse. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded, motioning for her to sit down. "I'm here. Say what you need to say." Sophia sat down slowly, her hand shaking slightly as she set her purse on the table. She looked up at him with watery eyes, her face etched with guilt and regret. "Hector, I know I don't deserve this. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. Truly, I am." Hector leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're sorry now? After everything?" She bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was wrong. I thought I could have everything. I thought leaving you was the answer, that I could find happiness with him. But it wasn't real. None of it was real." She wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. "He left me, Hector. He used me, and then he moved on to someone else. I'm alone. I'm broke. I have nothing left." For a moment, the only sound between them was the soft clinking of cups and chatter of the cafe. Hector looked at her, the once proud woman who had discarded him like an old toy, now sitting across from him, shattered. He could see the depth of her despair, the weight of the choices she had made. But he had made his choice too. "You thought you could walk all over me," Hector said, his voice steady but firm. "You thought you could humiliate me, toss me aside like I was nothing, and then come back when it all fell apart." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "That's not how it works, Sophia." She winced at his words, her tears falling freely now. "I know. I was selfish. I was stupid. I see that now. I thought I needed all of those things. The money, the gifts, the lifestyle. But none of it mattered in the end." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to take his. "Please, Hector. I made a mistake. I miss you. I miss us. Can we try again? Please." Hector pulled his hand away, shaking his head. Her touch, once something he had craved, now felt foreign. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the plea for salvation. But it wasn't his job to save her anymore. "You don't miss me," he said quietly. "You miss what you lost. The security. The comfort. You miss having someone who cared about you. But that's gone, Sophia. You killed it when you walked out on me." Her face crumpled, her sobs quiet but heavy, her body trembling as she tried to hold herself together. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." Hector stood up from the table, grabbing his coat as he prepared to leave. He looked down at her, seeing the broken person she had become, but there was no satisfaction in it for him. This wasn't about revenge or watching her suffer. It was about moving on, finally letting go of the last piece of the past that had haunted him. "You can't fix this," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You made your choice, Sophia, and now you have to live with it. Just like I had to live with what you did to me." She looked up at him through her tears, her eyes pleading. "Please, Hector, don't leave me like this. I'm begging you." But Hector was already walking toward the door. He paused for a moment, turning back to her one last time. "I've moved on," he said, his voice calm, final. "You should too." And with that, he walked out of the cafe, the cool air hitting him as he stepped outside. The sound of Sophia's quiet sobs faded behind him, drowned out by the busy noise of the city. As he walked down the street, he felt a strange sense of lightness. A weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The past was behind him now, truly and completely. For the first time in a long time, Hector felt free. Hector never looked back. The day he left the cafe, his conversation with Sophia marked the final chapter of a painful part of his life. As the door of that coffee shop closed behind him, it felt as though the door to his past had shut as well. He didn't need to dwell on her mistakes or her downfall anymore. Instead, he was determined to live the life he had rebuilt, one that was grounded in peace, self-respect, and a hard-earned sense of stability. In the months that followed their final encounter, Hector poured his energy into his work. His investment firm continued to thrive. What had started as a risky move years ago had turned into a successful business venture. He worked with integrity, built trust with his clients, and watched as his career flourished. But more importantly, he found solace in the small, everyday victories of life, something that had been missing in the chaos of his marriage to Sophia. Every morning, Hector took time for himself. He would grab a coffee, go for a jog along the waterfront, and appreciate the quiet moments. The pressure of trying to live up to someone else's expectations that were never truly about him, was gone. For the first time in years, Hector felt free. His success wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was just about enjoying the rewards of his own hard work. He forged new friendships, too. After cutting ties with the toxic remnants of his old life, Hector surrounded himself with people who lifted him up, who valued his company, and treated him with respect. These friends weren't after anything material, just genuine connections and shared experiences. It was a stark contrast to the superficiality that had defined his relationship with Sophia. But as Hector moved forward, Sophia continued to spiral. The glitz and glamour that had once surrounded her life evaporated quickly after her lover abandoned her. Without the gifts, the designer clothes, or the lavish dinners, she was forced to confront a harsh reality. She had traded something solid for something fleeting. Her new apartment, far from the luxury high-rises she had once flaunted, was cramped and in disrepair. She scraped by, picking up odd jobs here and there, never quite finding her footing. The attention she had once received, the compliments, the envy of others, the admiration, had all vanished. She was left with the consequences of her own choices, and no one around her to blame. Sophia often thought about Hector during this time. She wondered what might have been if she hadn't left him, if she hadn't chased after the excitement and luxury her lover had promised. She knew it was too late now. Their final meeting in that cafe replayed in her mind over and over again. His words, calm but decisive, echoed in her thoughts. "You made your choice, Sophia. Now you have to live with it." And live with it she did. Every day, Sophia woke up to the realization that she had thrown away something real, something that could have lasted. The thrill she had once felt when she walked out of Hector's house that night in a bikini seemed laughable now. What had it gotten her? Nothing but isolation and regret. She thought about reaching out to him again, but she knew it was pointless. He had moved on, and she was left in the ruins of the life she had built on vanity and selfishness. In her darkest moments, she understood that her downfall wasn't just bad luck. It was the inevitable outcome of her own actions. Meanwhile, Hector found love again. Several years after his divorce, when he least expected it, he met Claire. She was everything Sophia wasn't: kind, supportive, and most importantly, she valued Hector for who he was, not for what he could provide. Their relationship grew slowly, built on trust and mutual respect. With Claire, Hector didn't feel the need to prove himself, nor was he weighed down by the fear of not being enough. They traveled together, exploring new places and sharing laughter in ways Hector hadn't experienced in years. He felt a warmth in his heart that had been missing for so long. Every day with Claire was a reminder of what a true partnership should be, something he had once thought impossible after the betrayal he had suffered. As the years passed, Sophia became nothing more than a distant memory for Hector. The pain of her betrayal had long since faded, replaced by the joy and fulfillment he found in his new life. She was a lesson, a reminder of how fragile and fleeting superficial desires could be. But more than that, she was an example of how chasing temporary thrills could destroy something truly precious. Hector had no desire for revenge, no need to see Sophia suffer. Life had taken care of that for him. His victory came not through vengeance or spite, but through moving on, through finding happiness and peace in the wake of the storm she had caused. In the end, Hector lived the life he deserved, a life filled with love, success, and contentment. He had his closure, not by getting even, but by simply walking away and never looking back. For Sophia, life never quite recovered. Her choices had led her down a path of loneliness and regret, and she was forced to live with the consequences every day. The luxury, the attention, the designer bags, they had all been fleeting, and now she was left with nothing but memories of what could have been. And as Hector continued to thrive, Sophia watched from the shadows, knowing that she had been the architect of her own downfall.